Simplicity sewing for dummy patterns can be very encouraging for beginners and rusty returners alike. They're very straightforward and easy to follow. The pattern I'm going to sew today is Simplicity 9873. There's a choice of views or different shapes on this pattern, and I'm going to do view C, which has a bow on the front and piping around the edges. I've got the pattern instruction sheet out, so the first thing to do is to have a look at the pattern instruction sheet, see what pieces you're going to need for the view that you're going to make. Now this cushion is very, very simple. It has the same front and back, and then it has the bow detail, which is optional, and the piping. So this is the piece for the bias piping. As you can see, there's a grain line arrow, so it's got double arrowheads either end, and this line has to be perfectly parallel with the selvage of the fabric, which is the bound edge. To make sure it's perfectly parallel, I'm going to measure from this end of the line to the edge of the fabric, so here it's 13 centimetres. The other end is also 13 centimetres, so that it's nicely parallel with the selvage edge, and once that's parallel you can pin around the outside edges. So cut out around the solid line, and you can see I'd left the pattern quite roughly cut originally, and now as I cut around the solid line I'm cutting that excess tissue off at the same time. And when I get to the notches, I cut out around the notches. You can see there's a solid line and there's a dotted line. The dotted line is the stitching line, and indeed if I cut the notches inwards as they're shown, I will be cutting far too close to the stitching line and would end up having a hole. So always cut outwards around notches. This is the bow section, so it's the next part. I've put the bias cut strip away for the moment. I'll come back to that later. The bow section has a 1/2 inch hem allowance on the long edges. So I've turned up my 1/2 inch, tucked the raw edge under again and pressed in place. And then I'm going to top stitch along that inner fold. Pop it under the sewing machine, and I'm going to move the needle across a little using my stitch width button. When you want a straight stitch, you can use your stitch width button to move the needle to the left or the right. I'll just move it a couple of little ways, just so that I'm stitching on the edge of that inner fold. Let's lock the stitches in. And I'm using the edge of the presser foot as my guide, so I get a nice straight row of stitching, and of course a thread colour to match the fabric. So that's stitched and ready. So from the underside I've used a contrast thread so that you can actually see it. I'm now going to make the knot section, so that's part of it and this is the other part. So I have to fold my knot section in half, right sides together, notches matching, and then stitch along the stitching line, which is about 1 centimetre on this pattern, or 3/8 of an inch. Stitch along there, and once I've done that I can turn the piece through. This one I've already stitched. So I'll turn this through to the right side and then sort of refold it so that that seam is in the centre. So if I refold it like that and then press that, always press a seam before sewing over it again. So I'm going to press that nicely so that it's ready to wrap around my bow strip to make the bow in the centre. Then on my bow section I've found the centre by folding it in half and pin marking. I'm going to crush that centre together, and then with my fingers in place I can take away the pins and wrap my knot around the bow. And on the underside I'm going to tuck the raw edged end inside my neatened end. Tuck it in there like that and pin it in place. And then I will hand stitch that edge there together, so that's my knot in place, and that will then be ready to put onto the cushion front. So I'm now going to lay the bow on the top so that the corner is in place, pull out my edges and pin it in place around the outside edge, and I'm going to just stitch around that outside edge to catch the bow in place, so I'll stitch just around there. Let's pop one in the corner as well. Do the same at the other end. So when I stop at the corner, needle down, raise the presser foot a bit to pivot the fabric round and stitch along the other edge. And I'm stitching quite close to the edge because obviously I don't want this stitching to show. This is just done to hold the bow in place for the next stage. So that's all ready now for me to do the next stage. And the next stage is to make the piping. So I want to make my bias strips first, and earlier on I had that piece all cut out ready. I'm now going to transfer the stitching lines onto the fabric so that I can sew it into the loop that I need. So I've used a chalk and a ruler to mark the cutting line from end to end, and I'm going to use those to cut along later, but the first step is to sew the two ends together. And this is the bit that often confuses people because you sew it in quite a twisted way. So right sides together, you match up the notches. And this is when people get confused because you sew together with the notches matching so that the lines will flow from one to another. And you actually have a bit hanging over either end. So I'm going to sew that together, and actually what you'll end up with is a seam sort of on the bias, which means it's more stretchy. So that seam is now stitched and ready. And then using my scissors, I can cut along my previously marked chalk line. And as I cut all the way round, just through the one layer, so make sure the underside isn't caught up in the cutting, I follow my chalk line, and it keeps going round and it spirals. So you get one long continuous strip. And that is now ready to fold in half, wrong sides together. So to make sure you find a bit that has the seam and fold it in half and press it folded in half. So that needs to be pressed on the ironing board. I'm just going to put a pin in that bit. Make sure I do it the right side all the way. Opening up that seam allowance, it's only a tiny seam allowance. And of course the seam allowance is now on the bias too. And this means that when I attach it to my cushion, it will go round the corners nicely without puckering because there's bias in it, there's some stretch in it. So the strip has been pressed wrong sides together. I've tucked the raw end of the short end under, so that's to the wrong side, and then I've sandwiched a piping cord between the layers, pushing it towards the fold all the way down the length. I'm now going to stitch down the centre just to hold that cord in place and to remind myself to not start at the very beginning but to start a little way on. I've double pinned, so I'm going to stitch from there all the way to the end to hold that cord in place. So for this row of stitching, I can use the regular foot, and when I add the piping to the cushion front, then I'll use the zipper foot. Go forward and backwards. And again, I stopped before the very end. So I take that out, And this is now ready to pin to the front of my cushion front. So I've stopped short at that end and I started a little way in at that end. We now need to attach the piping to the front of the cushion. So with the cushion right side uppermost, I'm going to pin the piping to the edge. I'm going to overlap it very slightly. And as you can see, I've still got that end open with the short end tucked in. So I'm going to start stitching, as I did before, a little way from the start, so about there, and stitch down to the corner. And this time, I want to stitch closer to the actual piping cord than before. So in order to do that, I'm going to put on the zip foot so that I can get closer to that bulky piping. The zip foot is the one with a single toe and grooves either side. So when I attach that foot, I want to make sure that the actual foot is as far away from the chunky piping as possible. So I shall attach it to the bar on this side. And to do so, I line the bar on the foot with the groove on the foot holder. Make sure the thread isn't caught in that. And lower the foot onto the bar. Because the foot is different to the one I was using just now, I want to make sure that the needle is going to go down through the little groove by the side of the foot and not hit the foot at all. I'm also going to move it over. So I'm going to move over the needle as far as I can, which that little beep told me it's as far as it can go. So I've now got the stitching quite close to that piping cord, and you can see it sort of bulk up, and as I'm stitching I can feel along. It's not as close as I want to get, because when I do the next row of stitching, adding the front to the back, I'm going to get even closer to that piping cord. But for this one, closer, so you're to the left of the previous row of stitching. So again, forward and back to anchor the stitching, and then off we go down to the corner. So as I get close here to the pin, which is at the corner, I'm going to stop with the needle down and then raise the presser foot so that I can snip into the fabric of the piping on that angle, so that I can now pivot it round and have it going along the next row. Push it down, lower the presser foot, and off we go again. So I'm just going to put in a couple of pins just to hold it in place. Again, I'm going to pin at the other corner so that I'm ready to stop with the needle down. So I'm now going to get back to the beginning. So I'll just do a little bit further. And when I'm about 2 inches or 5 centimetres away, stop with the needle down. I'm going to trim off the excess, and I want to trim it so that there's an overlap, probably about 1 inch or 2.5 centimetres. Just trim it off. And this is why you left that bit open, so I can now open that up and put that inside. But what I want to do, I don't want 2 lots of cord, so I'm going to trim back the undercord so that the cord ends meet. Push that in. Make sure it's a nice snug fit. Pin the layers together. And then I can continue sewing. So I'm going all the way across all of those layers now till I reach the beginning where I started to stitch. Back stitch there. So So that's now attached nice and neatly all the way around with the ends neatly overlapped. And that is ready for me to put the back on. So I sandwich the piping and the bow between the back and the front, so right sides together. I've pinned all the way round and I've turned it over so I can see the previous row of stitching. I've also double pinned because I need to leave a turning gap. So I've double pinned to remind me to stop stitching when I get to there, and double pinned when I'm going to start stitching. So pop it under the foot, and I'm going to just move it over just one tweak so that this row of stitching is to the left of the previous row, which is why I've turned it over so I can see that previous row of stitching. Take out my pins. And this is when it's a really good idea to feel either side of the piping cord as you stitch, so that you're sort of giving it definition and you're stitching as close to the cord as you can. As you get to the corner, again, stop with the needle down, pivot it. You can take 1 or 2 stitches on the actual corner. So I'm going to pull that pin out just to be sure. Pivot it round a bit more, and again I'm feeling for the cord either side so I can make sure I stitch to the left of the previous row of stitching. So here I am now back at the double pin mark, so that reminds me I'm going to stop here so that I'm leaving my turning gap. Lock the stitches by back stitching, and now I'm going to trim off the edges and cut the corners at an angle and trim off about half of the seam allowance. And then the next thing to do is to make sure the fabric doesn't fray. I'm going to go around with a zigzag stitch, so half the stitch, the zag, is off the right edge of the fabric. I'm not going to cut the bit that I've left open. I'll leave that seam allowance whole because it actually makes it easier to tuck it inside when you need to later on. So that little bit I leave uncut. So that's now ready for me to zip round there very quickly. So again, I'll start from here, zip round with a zigzag stitch all the way round, just to make sure those edges don't fray away. So I'm turning it through, pushing out the corners, pulling them out. And that's ready to have a nice press, tucking the raw edges under of the opening gap. So I tuck those under ready. I'm going to pop a pin in place so that when I press this, those edges will be pressed in as well. Then it's ready to insert the cushion pad and then slip stitch the edges closed so that the cushion pad is kept inside. But there it is, ready to be pressed and stuffed.